Marc Marquez has just revealed something that could be far more serious than his 7th-place finish at Silverstone. After the race, footage from inside Ducati showed Marc admitting that he had no control over his right arm and that he was actually at risk of crashing. And this is especially worrying because the right arm has already been one of the biggest physical problems Marc has dealt with this season. He came to Silverstone hoping the summer break would make him stronger. Instead, he left Britain with a major question hanging over his championship campaign. Is Marc Marquez's right arm becoming the biggest threat to his title? Marc Marquez arrived at Silverstone after a 3-week summer break with one very clear objective: come back stronger. The reigning MotoGP champion had already been dealing with problems involving his right arm earlier in the season, and he had undergone surgery on his right shoulder in May. The procedure was aimed at addressing complications connected to his previous shoulder injury. MotoGP reported that Marc underwent another operation on the injured right shoulder, while later reporting from the race explained that the surgery involved removing 2 screws and a fragment of bone. There was also an important detail behind Marc's earlier loss of strength. A technical report from GPone suggested that the hardware could intermittently compress a nerve depending on the position of Marc's shoulder and arm. That would help explain why Marc could feel relatively normal away from the MotoGP bike, but experience problems once riding in the extreme position required by a modern prototype motorcycle. And this is important because Silverstone was never going to be an easy place to test a recovering arm. Ducati itself described Silverstone as a long and extremely demanding circuit. So when Marc arrived there, the physical demands were already going to be enormous. And Marc had actually hinted before the summer break that the problem wasn't completely behind him. After winning at the Sachsenring, Marc said he still needed to make a step forward with his right arm. That means Silverstone wasn't necessarily the beginning of the problem. It may have been the weekend when the problem became impossible to hide. The weekend started badly for Marc. In qualifying, he managed to secure direct access to Q2, but he was only 6th quickest while Pecco Bagnaia struggled further down the order. Then came the sprint. Marc's Ducati suffered from extreme rear tire degradation with the soft compound. It was a problem Marc said the team had not experienced during practice. He could only finish 9th in the sprint. And that already suggested Ducati was struggling to understand the Silverstone conditions. But Sunday was even more difficult. Marc finished 7th after 20 laps. That result alone would already have been disappointing for the reigning champion. But what happened immediately after the race is much more revealing. In Ducati's behind-the-scenes footage, the team gathered around Marc. And Marc explained what he had experienced during the race. He said he was at risk of crashing because he had no control over his right arm. He also described losing the front at Turn 1 and Turn 9 compared with what he had experienced during practice. For any MotoGP rider, that's a frightening situation. Because this isn't simply about having pain. It's about controlling a 250 horsepower prototype motorcycle while braking, changing direction and accelerating at extreme speeds. If the rider suddenly loses strength or control in one arm, the margin for error becomes almost non-existent. And Marc himself clearly felt that risk. What's particularly interesting is that Marc didn't simply struggle with his body. He was also fighting a Ducati that was nowhere near its usual level. While Marc finished 7th, Aprilia completely dominated the podium. Raul Fernandez won the British Grand Prix. Jorge Martin finished 2nd. And Marco Bezzecchi completed an all-Aprilia podium. It was one of Aprilia's strongest statements of the entire season. The official MotoGP report confirmed that Fernandez led every lap on his way to victory, while Martin's 2nd place strengthened his position at the top of the championship. For Ducati, meanwhile, the weekend became increasingly ugly. Marc was 7th. Alex Marquez finished ahead of him. Fabio Di Giannantonio was also ahead of the factory Ducati rider. And Pecco Bagnaia didn't even finish. Bagnaia crashed out on lap 8. Ducati's official race report confirmed Marc's 7th place and Bagnaia's retirement from the race. So this wasn't simply a Marc Marquez problem. It was a Ducati problem. But Marc's situation is more concerning because there is now a physical variable involved. And then there's the championship. Before Silverstone, Marc still had a realistic path to defending his MotoGP crown. But the British Grand Prix changed the picture. Jorge Martin finished second and extended his championship advantage. Marc slipped to fourth in the standings and is now 40 points behind Martin. 40 points isn't an impossible deficit in MotoGP. But it becomes much more dangerous when the rider chasing the championship is already dealing with a physical limitation. Because Marc doesn't simply need to recover points. He needs to consistently beat Martin. And he needs to do it while competing against riders such as Bezzecchi, Raul Fernandez and the rest of the Aprilia package. The biggest question coming out of Silverstone isn't, why did Marc finish 7th? How much is his right arm actually limiting him? Because Marc has already shown that when his physical condition is right, he can still dominate. At Sachsenring, he won the Grand Prix and took maximum points before the summer break. And immediately after that victory, he admitted that he still needed to improve the condition of his right arm. So Silverstone creates a worrying contrast. At Sachsenring, Marc looked like a championship leader. At Silverstone, he was telling Ducati that he couldn't properly control his right arm. That's a huge difference. And there is another layer to this. Marc's problem doesn't necessarily mean that he is seriously injured again. We don't have confirmation that he has suffered a new injury to the arm. What we do know is what Marc himself reported after the race. He felt that he had no control over his right arm and believed he was at risk of crashing. That's the part that deserves attention. And while Marc's physical condition is concerning, Ducati also has its own problems to solve. The team struggled with tire performance throughout the weekend. Marc's sprint was compromised by extreme rear tire degradation. Bagnaia couldn't find a pace. And then Pecco's Sunday ended with a crash that even he struggled to explain. After the race, Bagnaia said he didn't really know how to explain the incident and suggested there could possibly have been something on the track. That means Ducati left Silverstone without a clear answer in several areas. Marc couldn't fully trust his right arm. The bike struggled with tire performance. Bagnaia couldn't find a solution. And Aprilia swept all 3 podium positions. That's a pretty brutal combination. The good news for Marc is that the championship is not over. 40 points can disappear quickly in MotoGP. One victory, one bad weekend for Martin, and the entire picture can change again. But Marc now needs something more than speed. He needs his body to cooperate. Because Silverstone showed something we haven't seen from Marc often this season. For perhaps the first time in a long while, the problem wasn't that Marc wasn't willing to push harder. It was that his body was telling him to stop. And when Marc Marquez says he has no control over his right arm and is worried about crashing, that's something Ducati, and every championship rival, will be watching very closely. The next rounds will tell us whether Silverstone was simply a bad weekend, or the beginning of a much bigger problem for Marc's championship defense.